afraid for a dark night because the bombers didn't come over then, because it was a bright night and the bombers appeared and things like that. But the cars had sort of, their lights were masked off and they had a slit in it like that so they could just see where they were going. And you were allowed on your torch, you had to you have a slit so you could see where you were going. But like everything in life, you got used to it. You just learn to live with it.
Let's have Hannah, do you want to ask a question?
Yes. How did the war affect your life after?
Well, I started work at 14. I trained to be a hairdresser. And I got married at 19 and a half and started my family. So that was that. Can't say much more. But of course, rationing and things went on for quite a while after the war ended. So, you know, you sort of were still short of things because you didn't get any fruit. I was just saying to somebody, children didn't know what a banana was. So at the end of the war, they tried to eat it with the skin still on it because they'd never seen a banana or an orange or anything like that. No, the end of the war. Actually, to be perfectly honest, I think I quite enjoyed my war. At times it was pretty horrible, but...
Mason, do you want to take this one?
How did you celebrate the war once it was over?
Oh, they had great fun. In London they had marches and dancing and singing in the streets. And in our village we had a bonfire on the shore and a picnic and things like that. So every village did something different, or every town.
So just so we can get a bit of context, you were in Portsmouth for the Plymouth for the whole war.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So you didn't have to evacuate.
I didn't actually live in Plymouth.
Right.
I've got to put my arms out like that. Our village was in a bay, sort of like a U-shaped bay. We had an oil depot here on this arm, and the village went round there like that. And then this thing came around here, and the big tankers used to come in here and provide the oil for the depot. So, the Plymouth Dockyard was just across there, so we had all the Navy ships coming in, all the destroyers and aircraft carriers and things like that. Yeah. But this was the problem, you see. They were trying to mine the harbour. The planes would come over and drop mines in the harbour to sink the ships. But they missed the harbour and hit the town. So a lot of Devonport was destroyed by mines rather than bombs.
Gosh, that's amazing. Let's have Jane. Have you got a question?
Yeah. Were you ever evacuated?
No, I was. I say no for 2 days. But they actually hit the oil depot, and it was on fire. So we were just evacuated for the night. But the thing was, we were sent to a farm about 6 miles out, further out, and it was near an army fort. And the soldiers from the fort were in sort of dugouts in the ground, and the Germans came over and machine gunned them, so we sort of got out of the frying pan into the fire. We'd have been better if we'd stayed at home.
Joe, do you want to ask a question?
How did you socialise in your free time without... How did you socialise in your free time without things like Facebook?
Social life? Yeah. We didn't have much social life, to be perfectly honest. We had a services canteen that we used to go and help out at in the little town locally. But our village hall had been taken over by the Navy. The Navy set up a diving school and a torpedo school in the village. So our village hall was taken over by the Navy. So we lost all our entertainments.
And what was it like when the bombing raid actually came round? I'm guessing you had an
Noisy?
Yeah. Did you have an ambulance?
No. We had, because of the oil depot on this side of the tanker, we had a pipeline that went right through the village. And every so often in this pipeline there would be a hole in the ground, you know, with a cover over it, that they could look after the pipeline. So So each pipeline had a set of soldiers, men that weren't fit to fight. So they stood guard on this pipeline, and we sort of had them all there all the time. Yeah, sorry, I forgot what I was going to say.
Let's have Will. You've got a question you want to ask?
Did you think that the rations were necessary?
Yes, well they were, weren't they? Because most things that we have nowadays are brought in by ships. So therefore, things coming from abroad, a submarine would sink a ship and there was a lot of your stuff gone. So it was really, everything was all home produced in those days. They dug up the parks and planted potatoes, and big houses dug up all their lawns and planted vegetables and things like that. I mean, I was lucky because we had a big garden with an orchard, and my mother kept chickens and geese and things like that. So on the whole, we were quite well off, like for food and that.
Do you want to say something?
Was there anywhere you loved to go when you were anywhere you felt safe?
Pardon?
Was there anywhere you loved to go, during the war? Anywhere you kind of felt safe?
Go somewhere set.
Yeah, was there anywhere you loved to go?
When I loved to go?
Yeah.
Well, no, because if we had no cars or anything like that in those days, you see, I mean, it wasn't like it is now. We only had an occasional car or things like that. So you really didn't go very far. I mean, I had to walk 1.5 miles to school every day, because the school was in the little town next door. But you didn't really have time. You were too busy doing other things. So yeah, and trains and things like that, because of the raids there weren't many trains and things. And what trains there were was full of troops and things like that being moved around. So yeah.
Let's have
Did you ever use the black market? If so, what did you buy?
No way you didn't. No way you didn't do that. You'd probably get a policeman grabbing you by the collar if you did.
So just with that in mind, you said that your family was lucky because you had geese and chickens and a bit of land and things. Did you share with your neighbours and swap and trade?
Yes, my mother shared eggs and things like that, with our neighbours. My mother was a leading light in our village. She was an air raid warden and things like that. Okay. So she sort of shared with everybody. Everybody in the village had a garden of some description, but ours was just slightly bigger than everybody else's. So, yeah.
So what might you receive in return if you were saying, would you like to swap eggs with something? What would you get back, do you think?
Well, nothing really.
Okay.
You didn't look, we didn't look for it. So we all knew our neighbours so well and things like that. But, you couldn't do anything in our village without somebody knew what you were doing or knew what you'd done before you'd done it. So.
Joe, go on.
Do you feel negatively towards the Germans because of the war?
No, not at all. The leaders of the German nation were responsible for a lot of it, Hitler and Göring and all those people. But the common German people were probably just like us. They didn't want it. So, but it's a case, I think, of old men sending young men out to be killed. No, I don't bear them any grudge.
Okay. Kim?
How did you feel when you found out the war had started?
I don't know really, because it built up to it for quite a while beforehand. It was sort of gradually coming on the news that this was on. You must remember we had no television. We had a radio, a battery-operated radio, and that was it. And the only way you could see anything about the war was if you went to the cinema and it was on the Pathé News. Not like you could now watch a war on the television. We couldn't do that. But I don't think we thought about it much because we didn't really know what was going to happen. So it was just a case of learning to live with it, really.
Okay. Mason,
did you know anyone who fought in the
British Army abroad, and if so, how did you feel?
Yes, my cousin was a prisoner of war in Japan. He was on that, you probably heard of the Burma-Siam Railway that all the prisoners, a lot of the prisoners died on. He was a prisoner for 3.5 years on that. And when he come home, he was just a living skeleton. He hadn't worn shoes all the time he was there. He'd had black bread to eat and rice and things like that. But it took him ages to get over it. He'd come and visit us, but he wouldn't come into the house. He'd stand at the gateway. It was captured at Singapore when Singapore was captured by the Japanese.
Just with that in mind, did he get any support, like from the army after that, or
no,
was he
they
just?
didn't in those days.
Right.
No, that's something now with the modern army that they get. But he just came home and got on with his life, and that was it.
So what did he do after that?
I don't know what he did, to be perfectly honest. No, he was really, his health was really bad when he came back naturally. You know. Yeah. He was too really scared to do anything very much of anything. So,
Joan, and then Lisa.
With what's happening in Crimea with the Russians, do you feel for the people living there?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do feel for them. You know, it's a difficult situation, isn't it? You don't really know what's going to happen with it. We just have to wait and see. But I just hope you don't get mixed up in it if anything does happen. Yeah.
We've talked about this, the parallels with the 1930s.
Yes,
and Hitler taking over Czechoslovakia and Austria.
That's right,
and things.
yes.
And the echoes of that at the moment with Russians going into the Crimea.
Yes, well, they're trying to get back the land that was taken away from them after the war, aren't they? Let's face it, that's all it is. They're trying to take back what they think belongs to them, whether it does or not. So, I mean, this is only the same thing as the Germans did before the war. They annexed different places and took it over. Yeah. So
you would have been a child in the 30s. Did you have much idea of what was going on in Europe before the war started?
Not really, no, because as I say, we didn't have television, and we had newspapers, and we were lucky because my dad was a bit of a radio buff anyway, so we had a radio, but I mean, you didn't listen to it all the time. You maybe just put the news on, and that was it.
And what did your father do? What was his job?
My father was in the dockyard.
Okay.
Yeah, he was a storehouse keeper in the dockyard.
And did he maintain that during the war as well?
Yes, yeah, all through the war. He used to fire watch and all during the war. Yeah, He actually, his health wasn't good. He had emphysema, which is a chest thing. But in those days, the submarines were fueled by acid batteries. You know, like your science teacher would know more about what I'm talking. And they were all in storage in the dockyard. And a bomb hit it, and of course all the gases and everything escaped, and he got it all on his chest and that, so he was sort of indirectly wounded in the war.
Izzy, that's right.
Did you have any hobbies during the war?
No, we were too busy doing too busy at school and things like that. We used to go fishing. I suppose you might call that a hobby, because we had the sea all round us,
So can you give us just an idea of so an average day? You'd be at school for most of the day.
Yeah.
What about on a weekend? What might you on a Saturday or Sunday? What might you do?
You always went to church in those days. So it was Sunday school on a Sunday, and on a Saturday, both my father and brother were cricket fanatics. So it was cricket teas on Saturday, helping mum and things like that, you know. But I had to do a share of the cleaning in the house and things like that on the Sundays.
John, that's another question.
Was the demand for jobs high?
Demand for jobs? Well, to be perfectly honest, we were talking about this the other day. If it hadn't been for the women taking over all the jobs during the war, I don't think we would have got anywhere, because all the men were called up. So the women took over. I mean, we had a barrage balloon. You know what a barrage balloon is? You've seen pictures of these big balloons that they put up? Yeah, with wire on to stop the planes flying over. That was manned by women during the war. And women built aircraft and serviced things, and they made munitions and things like that. So, yeah. And the only way you could get out of going into the services was becoming a bedding boy, which meant you had to go down the mines and work as a miner. And that was the only way you could get out of going into the services.
Let's have that dinner.
What food was difficult to get?
Pardon?
What food was difficult to get?
Well, I suppose everything really. I mean, except for vegetables, we were getting, but in a way, we were much healthier then than what we are now. So, yeah.
I'll just pass this.
Yes, that's a week's ration for one person. It's not all of it, because it's all I could gather together at the time. Oh, and there's 2 ounces of loose teeth, and we had no tea bags either,
So what's missing from there that you might be able to get?
Well, not a lot, really. I mean, you could get flour and things, because that was anything that was whole juiced you could get, and vegetables you could get as well. So, yeah. But I mean, that's a country thing. Town people probably wouldn't be quite so well off as that. You could, and meat, you could get meat as well. Which is, seems quite funny now, but according to my recipe book I've got here, it was 1 and 2pence in those days, which is, it's 6 pence nowadays. So I suppose you would about £0.5 of meat or something like that, and you might get 1 sausage per person. The sausages weren't rationed.
Right.
And fish you could get when it was in. I've actually had whale meat, but that was only once. We didn't have it again.
Isaac, do you want to ask another one? And then Joe.
Was it almost almost like a very big treat, or almost like one of those, it's this, or like when it came to something like bacon or something which was rationed quite deeply?
No, you could have, you had a ration book that you had to take to the, you registered with the grocer or whatever. I've been trying to get a ration book, but I couldn't get one. But that is the food ration book, and of course clothing was rationed as well. You took that, or your mum would have done it, you wouldn't have done it. Everybody had a ration book. So you took it to your grocer or whatever, and he cut the pages out, so you couldn't go back and have a second helping or anything like that. You got just what's on that plate, that's what you got for a week. Yeah.
Not much.
No, it wasn't very much, no, but because, you had vegetables, you had plenty of vegetables, you had plenty of cereals and things, flour and things like that. Dry fruit there was rationed, sweets were rationed, 12 ounces of sweets a month.
So did you ever go hungry, or because of your?
No, I can't ever remember being hungry. I mean, not at all. I mean, probably were people perhaps in the towns, if they lost their homes. I mean, you'd go into the shelter and your house was there, but when you came up, it was a pile of rubble.
So what happened to those people, people in towns, for example, if their house was destroyed? How were they helped? Where were they going?
Schools were, in towns like Plymouth, the schools would have been evacuated to the country. So all those places were used as centres for people to go until they could go to a relative or something like that. Yeah, you had to get permission to do any building or anything like that. Yeah. I mean, even furniture was rationed, clothing was rationed.
Joe, another question.
In the place that you live, were there air raid sirens?
Yes, yeah.
What did you do when they went off?
Well, like everything else, you got used to them. It was a bit frightening when they first started, when we first sort of heard them. But we'd be in school and in class like this, and suddenly the air raid siren would go, and we'd have to run to the end of the playground. We only had tarmac playgrounds, so we had to run to the bottom because our air raid shelter was at the bottom of the playground. And we'd get down there and all sit on the seats, and then we'd have a sing-song, and somebody would get up and do a dance and things like that. So it was, in some ways, it was quite exciting, yeah.
So it was a bit like the fire alarm?
Yes. Well, the siren had two things. It went to start with, and the second one was a long note like that, and that was the all clear. So you just hid. But I must admit, after a while, because the bombing went on for really bad for about 2 years in Plymouth. Of course, London got it all the time, because you've heard about the flying bombs, have you? On London?
Yeah.
Probably not. The Germans sent over these bombs with a rocket motor on the bottom of it. And you could hear them coming, sort of like the engine. And all of a sudden that would stop, and the bomb would come straight down like that. So it was no good seeking a shelter or anything like that, because you didn't know where it was going. So you stood in the street and you prayed that it would go over the top of your head and stop when it got over there, so it went down. That was the V1s, but the V2s, they were silent, and they were rockets.
Yeah.
They were sent up from Germany, and they just landed anywhere. We didn't get them in Plymouth, but for obvious reasons, because London was the seat of government and things like that. They bombed it, well, out of all recognition, really.
Did you ever meet any soldiers from different countries?
Pardon?
Did you ever meet any soldiers from a different country?
Yes, Americans. We had, just before D-Day, when they sort of re-invaded back over into the continent, we had the lorries from the American Tank Corps. And what they did just before D-Day was they hid everything away in woods and things like that, so that if a German plane flew over, it couldn't see them. They were hiding away. And they were there on the 6th of June, wasn't it, the day? On the 5th of June, they were all there. By the 6th, every one of them was gone. They brought in a landing craft, and they loaded all these men and lorries onto these landing craft, and by the next day they were all in France. It was as quick as that. They just gradually, quietly brought people in. I think we had the Americans spread a couple of months, you know.
And what were they like? Were they nice to be around? Were they billeted in houses and things? Or?
Well, they had their own camps and things like that. My dad was in charge of doing the oil for the lorries, petrol for the lorries and things like that, because he was working at the depot, oil depot at the time. But no, they were great, because they had things that we hadn't been able to get. I mean, the children would chase them around, and chocolate and chewing gum and things like that. They had literally everything, the Americans. It didn't go without a thing.
So as a child, was that quite exciting to have foreigners, the Americans around?
Yeah, when my mother used to go, as I said, to the canteen in Tor Point, the services canteen, and she'd bring all these waifs and strays home, so we had a couple of them come and had meals with us and things like that, you know. And yeah, they were quite nice. They were always smart and well turned out and polite. Too polite sometimes.
That's
did any of your friends' houses get disturbed by the bombs, or did your house get affected?
Well, we only had a couple of our houses in our village that were actually bombed. We lost our windows quite a few times, because when a bomb goes off, it produces a blast at the end, so it blew all the windows out and things like that. But I think because we had a barrage balloon in the village, it was kept away. And of course, they weren't after us; they were flying over us to get to the dockyard more than anything. Yeah. But the centre of Plymouth, it wasn't a dockyard; it was all the shops and Plymouth was a beautiful city before the war, but the centre of it was totally destroyed completely. When I went to work, all it was tarmac roads with piles of rubble either side. And the place that I worked in, all the top of it had been on fire with incendiary bombs and things like that. So.
And did you put the masking tape over the windows or not?
We didn't know. We didn't know. We just lost our windows. I know they did offices and things like that. You know, they did it. Yeah.
Okay. Let's have Hannah, yes.
What was your favourite part of the celebrations?
I don't know really, because I was still quite young at that time, so we just sort of sat round and had a bonfire, and all the boys and girls got together, and we probably danced or something like that. I don't really remember very much about that.
Okay. Isabel, you got a question?
During the war, were you allowed out, or did you have to stay in the house for your...
Oh, no. You could go to the cinema and things like that, you know. Yeah, oh no. And they had dances in the local town and things like that. So everything really went on exactly the same. So, yeah. You just, if you heard the air raid siren, you just made the nearest shelter. Just because, of course, everything that goes off has to come down. So if a shell went off, which actually is quite exciting at night, watching all the shells and the searchlights and things. So the shell would go up and burst, and of course all the bits would come down. So you didn't stand in the street because you could be hit by a piece of hot metal coming down from the sky. Children used to go out in the morning and collect the bits of metal, shrapnel, and collect it. But if you picked it up to start with, it was quite hot, you know, after. But it was quite exciting actually. I've only ever once, I think, seen it, and that's watching the German planes would come in. Of course, the Spitfires and Hurricanes would come, and at night they'd fire, and you could see all the little tracer bullets, these little lights where they were firing them, and then the searchlights would all come on, and they'd catch a plane in the rays of the searchlight, and all the guns would fire trying to shoot it down. Quite exciting in some ways.
So nighttime is noisy then?
Oh, it certainly was noisy, yes, yeah. Oh, but yes, very noisy all the time, because guns were constantly firing, trying to shoot planes down, and the bombs were falling, and the planes were going over, yeah.
So when you were at school, did lessons just carry on as normal? Or?
Yes, yeah. We just carried on sitting at desks like you're sitting here, and then, as I say, when the sirens went, you went to the shelter.
So did you do anything differently at all at school because the war was on?
Nothing, we just did exactly the same thing, yeah. Well, originally our school was a primary school, but the second half of the school was all girls and all boys. But then, of course, teachers got pulled up, and the school was mixed. So when I went to school, we had boys and girls together in class. So.
And do you think that was pretty common? Do you think they did that on purpose, like try and keep everything as normal as possible for the children?
I think they probably did, yes. I mean, I suppose in towns, children that came back from evacuation, they wouldn't have got any education because the schools would have been closed and the schools would have gone out into the country somewhere, you know. They amalgamated a lot of the country schools with the town school. So they were quite big classes.
Jodie, let's go.
What were the conditions like in your house?
In my house? Well, we had no electricity to start with, and no bathroom, and an outside toilet. But other than that, we were quite happy, I think. We had a 3-bedroom house with 2 bedrooms, 2 rooms downstairs, and the kitchen. No fridge, no electric stove, but just a black stove in the corner. And no bath, so Mother had a wash house with the copper, so she'd light the copper and fill it up with water. You'd get the tin bath out and you'd sit in the wash house and have a bath in the tin bath.
And because they probably would have experienced it, can you just describe what the outside toilet was like?
No, I don't think so. It's too near lunchtime. I don't think you want me to
Just,
describe that.
Very dirty, very cold.
No,
very...
no. It was. We just had an ordinary toilet to start with, but we had a chemical toilet later on, which sort of things. No, I don't think you want to hear about that. It's too near lunchtime. You use your imagination.
Did you ever try to forget that the war was taking place?
You couldn't really forget that the war was taking place because it was there in your face every day, in one way or the other.
We hear nowadays a lot about the Blitz spirit. Would you say your community was strengthened at all by the experience?
Yes, everybody. It was the wartime spirit, they called it, and everybody pulled together. Didn't matter where they were, streets and things like that. I mean, at the end of the war, every street had a big party, and everybody contributed something. Jellies and cakes and things, and the tables were laid out, and the kids all had paper hats and things. It really was a good community. Everybody, just worked together. And in trouble, everybody helped everybody else.
Yes, Shannon.
What was the biggest change you noticed after the war was over?
Well, I think the biggest change was to women, because women came into their own. It started in the First World War that women came in. They drove buses and things like that. But because all the men were called up, the women were just called to do jobs that nobody else would do. And I think really that made a lot of difference to the freedom of women. So in some ways, you girls have probably got the war to thank for a lot of things.
Go on, Jenny.
What you said about the war spirit and helping communities, do you think that's missing from communities?
Oh yes, I think it is these days, yes. Do you all get with your neighbours and talk and mix together? I doubt you do very much. No, everybody helped everybody else, I mean, because, as I say, you would go in the shelter and you come back the next morning and your house was a pile of rubble. Well, what do? You can't say, well, no, I'm not going to help you. You've got to do it, haven't you? If you've got a conscience anyway, you do.
Did you ever meet any people from other towns and villages who, to see what their experiences were like across the county or nearby, or did you have relatives nearby? Or
my brother lived about 10 miles out at a place called Callington. When the oil depot was on fire, I went and stayed with him for several weeks and things like that. But that was sort of about the only thing that I did. He came and fetched me on his motorbike, and I had a pillion ride on his motorbike. But he was working in the dockyard as well, but he was working on submarines, secret work on submarines during the war.
And you mentioned about the jobs and things. When the war ended and the men returned, how did they reconcile it? Because you've got women doing jobs with the men, and the men have come back. How did they sort that out? Was there tension, or was it?
I really don't know. I mean, I can't tell you about that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I know after the First World War, the women all gave up and let the men have their jobs back. But I don't think there was quite so much of that in the Second War. I think women were going out to work then, and they were quite happy to be doing it. Our life just went on the same as it had always gone on. So my mother became a councillor, and she was chairman of this and chairman of that and things like that. So our life was sort of around that sort of thing. They were beginning to build houses in the village, so she was caught up in a lot of that. Because my father wouldn't have anything to do with it, I was also caught up in it. So.
Izzy?
What's your opinion on the war? How did you feel about the situation?
Pardon?
What was your opinion on the war?
Well, I don't know really. I suppose in a way it was something that had to happen. But the silly thing about it was the Germans could have ruled the world in trade. The Germans were one of the best trading nations in the world before the war. Why they needed to take over other people's lands and that, I don't know. But, you know, to be perfectly honest, it's all just one of these things you just get on with life and learn to live with it. So.
We've had just a phenomenal wealth of information there. I wonder, we've had Joan asked a couple of really poignant questions about bringing it to modern day and things. Since the end of the war, you've obviously lived through the Cold War and when that ended, and that was that, and this is something which they'll be doing next year at GCSE. Was that something which you found equally as difficult, or was that something that other countries were doing that's far away from Britain?
I mean, the fact that we thought we were going to have a nuclear war, that really was frightening, you know, because, I mean, you heard so much about the nuclear thing, and my husband was actually, well, we weren't married then, but he was actually out in the Far East when the atom bombs were dropped. It was in Sumatra. So, I mean, we saw all the horrible pictures that came out of there, and of course, if you thought that was going to happen in this country, you would naturally be worried about it. Yes, it was quite a worrying time, that, the Cold War, I must admit,
Do you have an opinion on the dropping of the atom bombs? Is it something which... we've looked a bit at, you know, whether it was right to use or not and some of the effects and things. Because
it was a difficult situation. It really wasn't us that did it. It was the Americans that dropped it, you see. So,
But as the British, did you think that was the right thing to do, or did you not have enough? Because I know you're quite young.
It obviously wasn't because of it was so horrible. I mean, you know, people just virtually disappeared, you know, with the heat and that from these things. Oh no, I don't think it was right. No.
Because obviously it ended the war, didn't it?
Yeah,
but
well, this is it. It ended the war. I mean, the Japanese were so cruel. You know, it was unbelievable. Now I'll tell you something, and I'll ask you a question. Do you think that anybody would have used poison darts during the war?
Not sure. Maybe the Japanese.
Yeah.
Chance, but.
Right, well, I'll tell you a story. My husband was actually hit by a poison dart. He was in Sumatra, and the river clearing up after the Japanese. He was hit in the leg by a poison dart fired out of a gun by a sniper in a tree. And luckily, the Gurkha soldiers were there, and they used some of their jungle magic and managed to sort his leg out, and all he had was a little white mark left on his leg. But my husband was actually hit by a poison dart.
So what was he doing?
He was in the Navy.
Right.
He was in a destroyer up a river, sorting it, clearing up after the Japanese and things like that. Because they just killed everybody and left the bodies laying, so these sailors had to go around and clear it all up after them, you know.
So you said earlier you don't bear a grudge against the Germans. Do you think that your husband felt differently about the Japanese because of his experiences?
He never talked about it, because I think where he was, it was so horrible that he never wanted to talk about it. You know, he talked about houses on stilts and things like that in letters that he wrote me, but he never talked about what he did or anything like that out there. No. So I think it was so disgusting, really, in some ways. Yeah. With the islands of Sumatra in those days apparently were a Dutch dependency, weren't they? And the Dutch had just cleared out and left everything to the Japanese. So.
Is there any other questions they want to ask it? Georgia?
Back to Europe now. Now we're aware of bombing raids done by British bombers on German citizens. At the time, were you at all aware, was there any talk about similar bombing operations by the British RAF on Germany?
Well, I suppose it was a case that they had to do it. They had to, I mean, they weren't going over to bomb the people. I mean, it's like in Plymouth. flood. They weren't coming over to bomb the people, they were after the dockyard. But the nature of planes and things like that. But I suppose in some ways they had to, you probably heard about the dam busters, and they broke down the dams to flood the Ruhr Valley, which put all of their munition places now out of action. Which that helped the war because they weren't able to make munitions and things like that. So in some ways, it had to be done. Yeah.
And we hear a lot about Churchill being a great war leader and things. What was your opinion of him at the time when you heard him making speeches or saw?
If we hadn't had Churchill, we would have never won the war.
Okay.
He was a great man, Churchill.
So what was it about him then that you think?
I don't know what it was about him, but he was really a good leader. I mean, we did away with party politics, everything. It was the best man for the job, which was, in my opinion, is how politics should be now. It should be party politics, but that's another story. Don't get me on my soapbox about that. No, he was a great man, Churchill, yes. He really worked hard towards getting it sorted out and that. Yeah.
So when you were a child, do you remember either like hearing a speech which kind of made you feel better about the situation, or is it?
No, as I said, we only sort of had a battery radio, so if your batteries had gone dead before you got them recharged, you couldn't find out it. I mean, this is the thing, we didn't have the information that you've got now. We had to learn by newspapers and things like that, you know. Or if we went to the cinema, perhaps Patty News would have a film about something, you know. But you really honestly just didn't know what was going on, so you lived around your own area and that was it.
So you just got on and
just got on with that. I mean, it's like everything, isn't it? When you've had it a while, you get used to it. I mean, lots of people in the end, they didn't even bother to get up when the air raid sirens went out. They just stayed in bed. So we had an air raid shelter because, as I say, we had these soldiers billeted looking at the oil vaults and that stay. And they dug us an air raid shelter, so we had quite a good air raid shelter. We had a brick one in the village that the council had built for us. Yeah.
And was that quite spacious, or?
No, you know, I don't know really why we didn't have more air raid shelters. But I know my uncle, he had one. They had an indoor one. It was like a right big table called a Morrison shelter. I don't know whether you watch Pointless, but the question came up yesterday on Pointless about this. In this Morrison shelter, it was just like a great big table. People used to keep it in the centre of the room with a cage underneath, and you got underneath, yeah. We had quite a good shelter. So.
Well,
How many people could you fit in an air raid shelter?
Well, there were different sizes. In London, people slept in the underground stations, so there would be hundreds of people sleeping there and everything. Some had bunks, some just had seats. An Anderson shelter, the metal ones that you put in the garden, I suppose 4 or 5 people could get into that one. Yeah. But ours was quite a big one. We could have got about 10 people in ours.
Hannah.
How censored was everything that you were told? Was everything that happened, were you told about it, or was it really, did you find quite a lot of things that happened in Germany's?
Well, no, you weren't told anything. There was big notices everywhere saying careless talk costs lives. So you weren't supposed to gossip about anything in case there was a German spy sitting over there. You could go back to Germany and tell what was going on. So you learned to keep your mouth shut, Hannah. Sorry about that, you did.
Is it?
When you were in the air raid shelters, what did you do?
Well, at school, we used to, as I say, somebody would get up and sing, and somebody would get up and dance, and we kept ourselves amused, you know. But of course, during the day, you didn't have very long range. It was more at night that you got the big, when the hundreds of planes came over. Because, I mean, they didn't just come over in 1, 2, they came over in hundreds of planes. With not just bombers, but fighters as well, to come to protect them. So there was wave after wave after wave of planes coming in. Yeah. So it was noisy, very noisy.
Joe, no.
During the war, were you thankful, or maybe afterwards, were you thankful for what the fighter pilots did?
Oh yes, yes, they were brave young men. Yeah, really brave. I mean, some of them weren't much older than some of you. It was, you know, some of the boys put their ages forward and went in. But you say about the thing, but they were only young men, 18 and 19 and 20. So they weren't old men that were flying the planes, they were young men. And they were really brave, yeah. They saved us, I think, really, when the beginning of the war. They were sitting, waiting with all their gear on, ready for their siren to go to say, get up in the air, because you were always warned. This is why the siren went off. You didn't get the rain immediately after the siren, because there would be watchers on the coast, and they would count the planes coming in, and then they would pass it to the RAF plotters, and they would plot it on the map to say where they thought the planes were going to go. So the sirens, if they saw they were going towards Plymouth, the sirens in Plymouth would siren. So then about half an hour afterwards, you would get the air raid. So.
Were there any kind of special precautions that you had to take in case of, like, if there anything you had to wear, or?
Well, you always had to take a gas mask with you. The teacher would come through the school blowing the whistle, and you had to put your gas mask on to practice, you know, to make sure. But fortunately, we didn't have any gas, so we didn't need them.
Before the what we know as the Battle of Britain, that was, thankfully the Germans thankfully stopped, and that was going to be the invasion of Britain potentially. Were you told about that or warned about that at school? Because I believe at the time people were concerned the Germans were going to invade.
I don't think we really discussed it. We just got on with our lessons, and that was about it. You know, we just did our arithmetic and our reading and things like that. So. Yeah.
Did you ever hear your parents talking about it at home or not?
Well, no. I don't think you did really, because it was going on all around you, so you didn't really need to discuss it. You know, it was just there. It was part of everyday life, sort of thing. Yeah. Bye.
Joe.
Do you remember where you were when you were told that the war's finished?
I was at work. That was the 8th of May, 45. And I'd gone to work in the morning, and I was sent home from work because everything closed down, because that was the end of the war. So we were all sent home from work.
Were you expecting the news to come?
Oh yes, we were expecting it, I think. Yes, yes.
Did the celebrations start straight away?
Oh no, you know, you had to give them a chance to organise things and that. But as I say, every street had a street party, and it went on for ages. They had plenty to drink and things like that.
Did you know anybody who fought in the war?
Well, my husband did later on, but he didn't go into the Navy until 1943, so by the time he did his training. But my cousin was on, as I say, was on the Burma-Siam Railway, but that was the only ones. Because my father was in a job that you couldn't get called up, well, he was too old, and my brother was on secret submarine work, so he wouldn't have been called up for the services.
So just perhaps to round things off, and it's quite a tricky question perhaps, but when you grew up and you started having, you said you got married at 18 and 19 and had children, do you think that your experiences kind of affected the way you brought up your children and lived after the war?
No, not really.
No.
I don't think so. You know, it's you try to forget about it really more than anything else. I mean, when I had my children, some of the rationing was still on. I mean, my youngest daughter was born in 1950, so there was still rationing on, and she still had to have an identity card even in those days. So, yeah. So it was the war sort of hung on for quite a few years afterwards, you know, different things. Yeah.
Because we were talking yesterday about the rations and things, and how nowadays, with the recession we've been going through, people have been buying sort of cheaper cuts of meat, which people used to use in the war, for example. And I just wondered, is that like a legacy of the war? Do you nowadays still cook the same sort of things that you had as children?
No, I like curries and things like that. So I mean, I didn't have that during the war. I'm a pasta person and things like that.
Okay.
So, no.
Okay. Well, can we give Mrs. Lobban a massive round of applause?